MythVision.
Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. I have Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald joining me today. How are you, Dennis?
I'm fine, thank you, Derek.
Thank you. We're going to talk about the debate, but not just the debate. We're actually going to be delving deeper into your hypothesis, the Q plus Papias Hypothesis. And this is important because when you came into the debate, I must say this up front, you weren't coming in like, let's quote Bible verses and give examples. You were thinking methodology, and you were trying to point out, and you said that in the debate, you were trying to point out methodological differences and why your approach, would be a better hypothesis than the approach that Dr. Goodacre would bring. And mainly that was the argument. However, Goodacre wanted to go into examples. So today we get the opportunity to take a deeper dive into your side that wasn't able to do so in the previous episode. I also want to say up front on air, I apologize for getting your education mistaken there, because one of those educational credentials are extremely important. Let's just put it this way. A PhD at Harvard University, I think that counts for something. And so I must say on air, I apologize. I did not mean to goof your credentials, and I know you don't mind that the mistake was done, but I just want to let you know that I apologize. So starting off real quick, AB Bob Jones University, MDiv McCormick Theological Seminary, PhD Harvard University. Dennis R. MacDonald received his PhD from Harvard University in 1978. Has taught New Testament and Christian origins at Goshen College and the Iliff School of Theology and the Claremont School of Theology. From 1999 to 2010, he served as the director of the Institute for Antiquity and Christianity at Claremont Graduate University. For the academic year of 1985 to 1986, he was a visiting scholar at Harvard Divinity School, and for the spring term in 1991, he was a visiting scholar at Union Theological Seminary, NYC, New York City. Twice, he was awarded grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities. In 1984 to 1985, he was president of the Rocky Mountain Great Plains region of the American Academy of Religion and Society of Biblical Literature. Long wind. This is a lot of good material here. In 1984 to 1985, he was president of the Rocky Mountain Great Plains region of American Academy of Religion and the Society of Biblical Literature. And in 2005 to 2006, he was president of the Pacific region of the American Academy of Religion and the Society of Biblical Literature. He also has served on editorial boards, chaired programs, units for various professional societies, and appeared as an authority on A&E, PBS, and the History Channel. For the most part, his scholarship has been devoted to Christian apocryphal writings, the Synoptic Problem, and the influence of classical Greek literature, especially the Homeric Epics, on Jewish and Christian narratives. Ladies and gentlemen, I can go on. There's a lot there. He has a lot of books. You need to go check him out. Go support what he's doing. My favorite, Dr. MacDonald, my favorite thing that you do personally is the connections to the Greek literature, just because I love stories. However, I didn't take serious the idea of Q. In fact, when I heard about Q plus, all this stuff, it didn't interest me at first. But as I delved deeper into these things, I started to go, oh my gosh, whoa, like this shows how things may have actually developed. And I can't wait to hear what you have to offer.
Well, after that introduction, I think I should stop now. I want your viewers to know that I did not put you up to that litany, but I do thank you for it.
Thank you.
I share your interest in mimesis in the Gospels of classical Greek poetry, and it's not just in the Gospels, the Acts of the Apostles, Apocryphal Acts of Apostles, and Jewish texts as well, including Josephus, by the way. But I think the solution to the synoptic problem also requires taking seriously the possibility that there was a lost gospel. And last time we talked about the evidence from Papias that he had a lost Greek gospel of Matthew, and most reconstructions of Q resemble Matthew more than they do Mark and have things in a different sequence, which is what bothered Papias. And Matthew has what we call doublets that are caused perhaps by having similar content in Mark and in a lost gospel. And I'll say more about that next time. But let me say that I have tremendous respect for Mark Goodacre. I consider him a friend. And I hope that came through in our so-called debate, which in most cases was a love fest, I think.
Yeah.
But you had to push us in places where we have disagreements. Well, I want to start with that by identifying the places where we have overlapping commitments that are different from, let's say, the two-document hypothesis and traditional reconstructions of Q. And then I'll get to some of the places where we disagree, and I'll try to give you then some examples that illustrate the Q plus hypothesis that I think make the FAR hypothesis very difficult to absorb, to accept. The points of agreement are, first of all, Mark in priority. That is, of the surviving Gospels, Mark is the earliest, and it was followed in sequence by Matthew and Luke, both of whom redacted or edited Mark. The second thing we agree on is that Luke knew not only Mark, but the Gospel of Matthew. And this is something difficult for advocates of the two-document hypothesis to accept, because they insist that Matthew and Luke are independent. Mark and I also, that is Mark Goodacre and I, also agree that one cannot solve the synoptic problem by almost promiscuously appealing to oral tradition, what he calls pulling the rabbit out of the hat, that there should be a literary solution, whether or not one needs to posit the existence of a lost gospel. But here's where the primary area of disagreement comes, and it's the one that you pushed on both of us to identify. Professor Goodacre, and I sometimes will slip and call him Mark, sorry.
He doesn't mind. Yeah, he's a really cool guy.
He is. Professor Goodacre grants that Luke could have known, that Grant could have known, in addition to Mark and Matthew, another source or sources. But he's skeptical about one's ability to know if Luke had other sources, and even more skeptical about any modern ability to reconstruct them. I, however, insist not only that Luke did know a lost coherent source, but also that much of it is recoverable because of a principle of reversed priority. Namely, instances when Matthew is more primitive than Mark, even though it was written later, and more importantly, the instances where Luke is more primitive than either Mark or Matthew, or in some cases both, even though it's written considerably after both. The criterion of reverse priority, by the way, is not my invention. Although I no longer adhere to a strict version of the two-document hypothesis, one of its enduring contributions to the synoptic problem is what its adherents call alternating priority between Matthew and Luke, when they are independent of Mark. This identification is necessary for reconstructing the lost gospel in the two-document hypothesis. In other words, when the Matthean and Lucan wording or sequence of sayings or logia disagree, one must decide which gospel more faithfully reproduces this shared source so that one can attribute that to the reconstruction. Now, Goodacre stated that determining relative priority is always subjective, and I agree with that, but that need not imply that it's arbitrary. In my work, I apply three often coordinating criteria to determine which of two parallel logia takes priority.
So let me ask you something real quick, Dr. MacDonald, before you continue. I feel like it would be very important if I could share even when we go through the examples. Of course, when I edit this down, I'm going to put some broader, bigger images for them to see on the screen. But I really feel like in this paper, this pamphlet that you have, we can share it on the screen maybe someone who is deaf can't hear. They could also read along with us, but it allow them to absorb what we're going to be reading, so they're not just looking at our faces, because you're going to get pretty technical today. And I think technical is necessary, not only for me to see the paper, but I feel like the audience could watch. How do you feel about that? Are you okay with me doing that?
Well, I think that's wonderful. And my paper is not all that long, so that I don't think that would be a major challenge either for you or your viewers. Okay. Well, I use 3 criteria for determining reverse priority. And alpha, I use Greek letters to distinguish them from other kinds of criteria, alpha, beta, gamma. The alpha criterion is independence is earlier than narrative contextualization. That is, when one version of a saying stands apart by itself, it generally is earlier than one assimilated into a narrative context. That's because Mark, in particular, likes to take a saying and to create a narrative around it to interpret it. Beta, difficulty, embarrassment, or ambiguity usually is earlier than an improvement. Namely, when one version contains a problem, it generally is earlier than one without it. Later texts tend to solve problems rather than create them, to enhance Jesus' stature rather than diminish it. Gamma, atypicalities usually are earlier than typicalities. That is, when one version displays characteristics typical of an author's style or theology, it generally is later than one that lacks such telltale traits.
This is important because independence and narrative contextualization. Can you give us, are we going to go into examples of what that is? Or?
I will. There will be one example, but I can give you, I'll give you one of those right now.
Please.
In the Gospel of Luke, we have a warning: stay away from the yeast of the Pharisees. Mark has that phrase, but it appears at the beginning of a narrative about the disciples forgetting bread when they're on board ship. So there, the yeast of the Pharisees is extended into a narrative. But we have several other examples too.
Okay. And then one I'd like to give about beta, if you don't mind: difficulty, embarrassment, or ambiguity. And maybe you can correct me on this. Like, for example, I've heard it said in the Gospel of John, for example, you have the women actually preparing the body of Jesus prior to them burying him. And the earlier authors goofed up on this legend by having to go to the tomb where he's already buried, just to try and give him the spices and try to prep his body. But he's already been buried for now a day or two. So the later gospel realizes, oh man, we got to have him being prepared before he goes into the tomb. And you can tell that he's trying to correct earlier mistakes, if you will, or problems in the narrative. Would you agree with that, or is that a bad example?
I would leave the Gospel of John out of it.
Okay.
But here's how I think the example works. Mark has a woman anoint Jesus for his burial before his death. That is very unusual. And the reason that happens is because there's a passage in the Odyssey where a woman identifies Odysseus by the wound, for his childhood wound. But the other authors, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, recognized that this was an awkward thing, and they enhance Mark's second anointing, where the women come to the tomb trying to anoint Jesus, but the reader knows Jesus has already been anointed by the woman at Bethany. But this issue of improving ambiguity or difficulties is characteristic throughout the Gospels. And in fact, it's also a criterion for textual criticism. When we compare two texts, let's say the Gospel of John, and one contains a difficulty and the other a solution, the difficulty almost always is earlier. I mean, it's just intuitive, isn't it?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. They're going to try and fix the problem, if you will. That's how I would. I mean,
yeah.
Fixing an issue. So what about atypicalities and typicalities? Can you give us one example and then we could press forward, or?
Sure. If I have two texts and one talks about the Father and another talks about our Father who art in heaven, we know that the Father who art in heaven is typical of Matthew. So this is one way of identifying the typicality of Matthew is going to be secondary to the text in Luke, in this case, that reads simply Father. But we have others too. For example, Matthew loves the phrase weeping and gnashing of teeth. Well, anytime we see that in a text, we're going to be suspicious that's Matthew's typicality. And if we have a text that doesn't have that phrase, we're going to say it's more primitive.
Interesting. Okay, awesome. Yes, sir.
Okay. In this presentation, I'll say little about Matthew's priority to Luke. For an obvious reason, Goodacre and other proponents of the Papias Hypothesis rightly will grant them immediately as evidence that Luke knew Matthew. So you really can't prove that you got a lost gospel in that way. But Goodacre and others struggle often cleverly to explain why Luke, which was written long after Matthew and Mark, often preserves earlier wording or sequencing. To express this reverse priority, I use a symbol to stand for earlier than, and it's a pointed bracket. And that will be, we'll have to show that in a diagram.
Okay.
Thus, in most cases, because Luke was written later than Matthew, one can write Matthew is earlier than Luke, using that pointed bracket. Goodacre argues that this nearly always is the case. But I would argue that often Luke preserves earlier wording, thus reversing the direction. In other words, Luke is earlier than Matthew with that same pointed bracket. Furthermore, the Q plus Papias hypothesis argues that such reversed priority results from Luke's reliance not on Matthew, but on a lost gospel. Now that's running ahead of the game a little bit.
Right.
But on the, you can see on the handout, a chronological priority would have Matthew first, then Luke. And Goodacre and I agree on that. But reverse priority says in some cases Luke is earlier than Matthew. And we have to decide why. Now, before I defend this conclusion about a lost gospel, I need to clarify two terms widely used in gospel scholarship that may be unfamiliar. The first is doublets. That is instances with when a logion appears twice in the same gospel. Now, Goodacre is right in saying that doublets do not require reliance on two sources, both of which contain the same logion, but in several cases they do, insofar as the non-Markan doublet is more primitive than what one finds in Mark. So I'm so glad you have this on the screen. That's what a doublet looks like. So Matthew has a non-Markan version of a saying and a Markan version of a saying. That's your doublet. One of those comes from Mark, but the other comes from a source unknown. So some people would say it's oral tradition, some would say it's the Q document or whatever. But we're going to beg that question for a moment.
Or if you don't mind, some will say, like I think Dr. Goodacre is trying to say, is that there may be, potentially there could be other sources, but this might just be the author's creativity or something like that, to try and explain why there's a difference or something. You know what I mean?
That's exactly what he would do. Yeah. Goodacre does not deny, so I guess I've done that. No, Goodacre does not deny existence of doublets, but would take exception to my insistence that the non-Markan doublet is more primitive and witnesses to a source unknown, which is what you just said, Derek. He would have even more objection to what scholars call non-doublets. And that's a very unfortunate and difficult term, which I prefer to call avoided doublets. And in print, I print the word doublet with a double strike through so that one sees that it's actually a damaged doublet. And you have a diagram of that as well. So it's similar to the one we saw before, where we have at the top a source unknown that's earlier than Mark. But for whatever reason, an evangelist decides not to include the Markan version. It's an intentional omission, often to avoid duplication. The author said it once, why repeat it? So we have a non-Markan doublet with the double strike through, but it still is a presence from potentially an alternative source. I'm not going to go into this issue of doublet and non-doublets too much. But as you'll see, it does play a role in our diagnosis later.
I'm interested in examples at some point, even if we do a future show, a 20-minute show on doublet, non-doublets or something one day, it'd be cool if you're interested. Or everyone just needs to read your work, to be honest with you. But
well, I think we have examples of doublets and non-doublets coming up.
Okay.
So maybe that will help us here. Because the primary point of disagreement between Goodacre and me pertains to Luke's knowledge of a lost gospel in addition to Mark and Matthew, I'm going to restrict my examples to Luke's reverse priority to them in just 4 sayings. And so the first one is the hidden will be revealed. So Derek, I'm going to have you read the middle column, the Matthew one. Okay. And I'll read on either side of it. I'll read Luke and then Mark. Now, one will notice that these parallels are in reverse chronological order. They should be, if they were chronological, Mark, Matthew, then finally Luke. But now we have reversed priority. Luke is earlier than Matthew, and Matthew is earlier than Mark. And this pattern occurs repeatedly. And it's one of the reasons why the synoptic problem hasn't been solved. Because sometimes Luke is earlier than his sources, and sometimes Matthew's earlier than Mark. So how do we handle that? So that's to illustrate the problem. And nothing is covered up that will not be exposed, and hidden that will not be known. Therefore, what you said in the dark will be heard in the light, and what you whispered in the ear in closets will be proclaimed on the housetops.
Matthew 10:26-27. So do not fear them, for nothing is covered up that will not be exposed, and hidden that will not be known. What I said to you in the dark, speak in the light, and what you hear whispered into the ear, proclaim on the housetops. Then Mark, which is then the source for Luke 8:17. In other words, Luke has a doublet. One time from Mark and another from somewhere. For it, the lamp, that is Jesus, is not hidden except to be disclosed, nor was it secret, but to come into public view. If someone has ears to hear, let him hear.
Luke's Jesus warns the 12 that what they whisper clandestinely will one day be outed. But in Matthew, what Jesus whispered into the ear, his followers must proclaim on housetops. Given the commitment of Luke to the expansion of the gospel in Acts, it is unlikely that he would have tampered with the command to missionize. Matthew thus seems to be a secondary improvement, criterion beta, on an earlier version to expand Jesus' instructions to the 12 about their mission, that is, Luke inverted priority to Matthew. And insofar as Mark could not have inherited the saying from Matthew, which did not yet exist, it is reasonable to think that he did so from a version more similar to Luke, without the command to proclaim. In other words, be sure your sin will find you out in Luke becomes be sure what Jesus says in secret becomes proclaimed. That's an improvement. Now confessing or denying. So I'll read a little bit and then you catch up to me, Derek.
Okay.
And in this case, there's nothing in the marking column for a little bit. But I tell you, my friends, do not be afraid of those who kill the body, but after that have no authority to do anything more. I will show you whom you should fear. Fear the one who after killing has the authority to cast you into Gehenna. Go ahead.
Oh, I thought you were going to read the whole thing and then I was going to read the whole thing. Okay. And do not be afraid of those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. But fear instead the one who is able to destroy both the soul and the body in Gehenna.
Yes, I tell you, fear this one. Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 cents, and not one of them escapes God's notice, but even the hairs of your head are all numbered. Do not be afraid, you are worth more than many sparrows.
Are not 2 sparrows sold for 1 cent? And yet not one of them will fall to earth without your Father's consent. But even the hairs of your head all are numbered. So do not be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows.
The next parallels are important, Derek. But I tell you, anyone who may speak out for me in public, the Son of Man will also speak out for him before the angels of God.
So whoever will speak out for me in public, I also will speak out for him before my Father, who is in heaven.
But the one who denies me in public will be denied before the angels of God.
But whoever denies me in public, I also will deny him before my Father who is in heaven.
So now we pick up Mark. Mark doesn't have anything about confessing, but he does have something about being ashamed. For whoever is ashamed of me and my words among this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. Now, 2 observations tip the balance toward the priority of Luke. First, verse 32 in Matthew clarifies that the Son of Man is Jesus, likely a secondary improvement to take care of the ambiguity of who the Son of Man is. Second, only in Matthew does one find the reference to God as the Father who is in heaven, so characteristic of that gospel. A secondary typicality, that is criterion gamma. Okay? Mm-hmm. The unforgivable sin. This is my favorite. And everyone who says a word against the Son of Man, it will be forgiven him. But the one who blasphemes the Holy Spirit will not be forgiven.
Truly, I tell you that, and whoever says a word against the Son of Man, it will be forgiven him. But whoever speaks against the Holy Spirit, it will not be forgiven him, neither in this age nor the age to come.
Now, in these parallels, I italicize wording that seems to be secondary. So we've already seen that, but in this case, it becomes really quite crucial. I tell you, this is Mark 3:28 to 30, which then creates doublets both in Matthew and in Luke. I tell you that everything will be forgiven the sons of men, not the Son of Man, their sins and whatever blasphemies they might utter. But whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit will never have forgiveness, but is guilty of an eternal sin, because they, his opponents at the Beelzebul controversy, were saying he has an unclean spirit. Now, these parallels are truly remarkable. The sayings in Luke and Matthew declare that verbal opposition to Jesus, the Son of Man, is forgivable, which the Markan evangelist clearly thought was unacceptable, and thus changed the singular and titular Son of Man to the plural and banal sons of men. Clearly, this is a Markan secondary improvement of a difficulty, criterion beta. Notice also the absence in Luke of the typical Matthean tag, neither in this age nor in the age to come, which appears frequently. That's criterion gamma.
If I may, this is really interesting because looking at your parallels here, seems like Luke is out of this context, in this particular context, has the least to say about anything here as well. I'm not going to say he doesn't have a lot of, there's other areas I'm sure he expands and such, but in this, what do you think's going on? And maybe this is interpretive, so I don't really want to get lost in that, but why does Matthew say neither in this age nor the age to come, but Luke doesn't do that? And then also, Mark seems to be, the way that Mark's writing this, just by my reading it, and this could be a perception thing, I don't know, I'm not the expert, but it just sounds like Mark is the latest in what he's trying to say about this topic. In terms of between the three, his material seems more detailed, and kind of like the example above real quick, if we don't mind mentioning this. When you talk about the Father, all right, so Matthew talks about the Father who is in heaven, Luke talks about the angels, Mark takes both of them, and he does both before the Father who is in heaven and the angels. That's quite interesting. I think that's interesting.
I think it's fascinating, and I think the first observation is actually brilliant, because frequently the Q document reads more like poetry that then gets somewhat garbled or expanded in Matthew. And then in Mark, that is, here I'm considering Luke as the earliest version of it. So the earliest version is lapidary and chiseled. The second one begins then the elaboration, and that's of the Q document. And then Mark comes along and he expands it even further and removes the difficulty. But Luke, coming later, in this case, seems to have preserved the earliest version, which often is, as you said, shorter and more balanced.
This is why it's so complicated, because it's not, it's not so simple. Mark does show a lot of times what Luke is appearing to show right here. A lot of times Mark is the least complicated and complex. It doesn't have the most material sometimes. But here you have an example where Luke is the perfect example of the earliest type of material, it appears. So
that's what it appears, yeah.
Interesting. This is good.
Before we leave this pericope, furthermore, in Mark and Matthew, this logion appears in the Beelzebul controversy, but not so in Luke, where it seamlessly continues the theme of confessing and denying Jesus publicly. In other words, here we have an example of Mark's secondary narrative contextualization. Criterion alpha. You asked for an example. This is one where the business about denying the Son of Man, speaking against the Son of Man, becomes in Mark and in Matthew a part of a context of a narrative context. Okay, we have one more to go, and then I have a surprise for you.
Awesome.
And by the way, this example, I haven't thought of it, of including it until now, but this is another example where even a summary look at Luke shows that it's more skeletal, right? It's thinner. It has fewer words. But as we go across the page, the words increase. You see that?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and read the whole thing, and then I want you to read the others.
Yes, sir.
The Matthew, and then I'll come in with Mark.
Okay.
And when they bring you to synagogues and rulers and authorities, do not be anxious how or what defense you will give or say, for the Holy Spirit will teach you in this hour what you are to say.
Matthew 10, 17 through 20. And be leery of people, for they will hand you over to councils and flog you in their synagogues. You will be brought before governors and kings because of me as a testimony to them and to the Gentiles. And when they hand you over, do not be anxious about how or what you are to speak, for what you should speak will be given to you in that hour. For it is not you who speak, but the Spirit of your Father that speaks in you.
Now, there's an example also of it in Mark that is even longer, and it creates a doublet in Luke 21, 12 to 15. This is Mark 13, 9 to 11 in his apocalyptic discourse. And watch out for yourselves. They will hand you over to councils, and you will be beaten in synagogues, and you will stand before governors and kings because of me as a testimony to them. And the good news must first be announced to all the Gentiles. And when they arrest you and hand you over, do not be anxious beforehand about what you are to speak, but speak whatever is given you in that hour, for it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. Obviously, in this case, Matthew and Luke strongly agree against Luke, but the non-Markan doublet in Luke surely takes priority insofar as it says nothing about Jewish juridical councils or beatings. There are no governors or kings, no bearing witness, no telling, and tellingly, there is no reference to Gentiles. Here then we seem to have a secondary expansion, and for Mark and Matthew, an improvement. Criterion beta. It makes it more explicit what the legal problems are going to be.
This is very interesting because I've read this passage quite a few times, and oftentimes Matthew sticks out like a sore thumb on how he likes to use the word Father a lot. Yep. In that hour, the Father will give you this. Neither Mark nor Luke even use that, but Mark doesn't even use it when it sounds very much similar to what Matthew does. And then Matthew's big on this Gentile distinction between the scattered, or if you will, lost sheep, and the Gentiles. And I just think that's an interesting thing. That's not here in this particular, but right prior to this in Matthew 10, verse 5, there's this like huge problem with don't go to the Gentiles, don't go to the Samaritans. I'm getting off track. But the point is I really, really am loving seeing how skeletal Luke is here. What is your guess? And this is just a guess. What do you think Mark would say about this particular thing? Do you think he would say, he didn't want that material, so he just cut that part out? Is that his little way out, you think? Or do you think he might suggest that he said enough in what he said and it didn't need to go into all those details? What's your guess? I know you can't speak for him, but what's your guess?
My guess is that he would say that this is a place where we're talking about not the evangelist Mark, we're talking about Mark Goodacre.
Yes.
That Luke saw the saying in Matthew. He's already used one version from Mark, right? He's got that doublet. So when he tells the thing in Matthew, I'm putting words in Mark's mouth, Mark Goodacre's mouth.
Right.
He doesn't need to say the whole thing again. He's already said it elsewhere. And so he can then chisel it back elegantly to a more balanced and trenchant form. So I think that's how he would argue.
So let me ask you, this is wonderful that you're playing the hypothetical here. What would be your problem with that take, if you don't mind me kind of poking in a little?
Well, it really means that Luke is remarkably clever, and actually I think he is. But when one finds so many examples of what seems to be a reverse priority, some of the manure sticks to the barn. I think it's a forced interpretation. Okay. So that would be my view.
Wow. Okay, that's interesting. That really is seeing why this is thinned out. What do you guys think? Comment down below. I'm interested to hear your thoughts. Thank you, Dr. MacDonald. I'd love to keep going.
Okay, there's only one more saying. And this one is not one of the four because it doesn't have a doublet or a non-doublet in any of the Gospels. But it appears in Luke, and then it appears in a narrative context in Mark, and then from Mark to Matthew. So I'll read the left column again, and then I want you to read the right hand. He began first to say to his disciples, "Keep yourselves from the yeast of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy."
Mark 8:14-16. And because they had forgotten to bring bread with them on the boat, they had only one loaf. And he commanded them, saying, "Pay attention and watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod." And they were discussing with each other that they had no bread.
This is a parade example of Luke's reverse priority to Mark on the basis of a secondary narrative contextualization, that is, criterion alpha. Luke 12:1 introduces an extended discourse that follows Jesus' denunciation of the Pharisees, but the Markan evangelist seems to have snipped the admonition from its original context and pasted it into his narrative about Jesus' rebuke of the disciples' incomprehension about bringing bread. They forgot about the feeding of the 5,000 and the 4,000. He also added the tag about the yeast of Herod, thereby adding a political threat to the religious one from the Pharisees. Now, thus far, I've limited the assessment of Luke's reverse priority to Mark and Matthew to a comparison of wording. But there's yet another consideration that for me is even more decisive: the relative sequencing. Can you scroll down to the next diagram?
Yes.
There we go. But it splits the page, so you're going to have to.
Okay.
There you go. There you go. There you go. The 5 columns devoted to the synoptics are arranged chronologically, not by the relative dates of their composition, but by the relative primitivity of their context. Their content. It thus suggests that Luke contains the earliest version of the saying, followed by Matthew. Mark comes third in the sequence, followed by redactions of it in Matthew, and finally Luke. In other words, Luke, Matthew, Mark, Matthew, Luke. In other words, though Luke was written last, 12:1-12 is earlier than its equivalents in Mark and Matthew. And in 4 cases, as we've seen, Matthew's non-Markan doublets and avoided doublets are earlier than Mark. Stated otherwise, Matthew contains content both earlier than and later than Mark, and Luke contains content both earlier than and later than Matthew and Mark. No wonder we have a synoptic problem. But if you notice the parallels, Derek, the pericope we've looked at appear in sequence only in Luke. Luke 1, 2-3, 4-9, 10, 11-12.
It's all in the same chapter.
It's all in the same chapter and contiguous. Matthew has them sprinkled in various places, especially in the mission speech. Mark has them sprinkled throughout his gospel. And then Matthew and Luke kind of follow suit. Now, the sequence that I want to look at in this part of the argument is often overlooked, and it's one for which I don't think Mark Goodacre has an answer. I want to give a précis of Luke 12:1-12 to show you how beautifully organized it is. It is coherent, whereas its parallels in the other Gospels, when assembled, are incoherent. The sequence of logia in Luke 12 is the most coherent and can be summarized here. Luke's Jesus in chapter 12 had brutally denounced Pharisees, Torah lawyers, and the Jerusalem establishment. And then in chapter 12, warned the 12 not to be taken in by the yeast of the Pharisees. Because what his disciples whisper in private one day will be broadcast publicly. Furthermore, they must not let themselves succumb to physical coercion. After all, the worst their opponents can inflict is death of the body. Their opponents have no authority to cast a soul into Gehenna. But God, who cares even for fallen sparrows, will hold court for the dead, a second trial, if you will, with his angels serving as jurors. Jesus, as the glorified Son of Man, will advocate for those who had confessed allegiance to him, but condemn those who had denounced him. The angels then will determine whether those who had denied Jesus did so because they saw him merely as the lowly Son of Man, which is forgivable, or denied the work of God's Spirit, which is not. Therefore, when the 12 are forced to defend themselves in hostile synagogues before their deaths, they must not worry. The Holy Spirit will teach you in this hour what you are to say. This elegant arrangement of logia is missing entirely in Matthew and Mark because of their different sequences. The editors of CEQ thus widely attribute all of Luke 12 to 12 to the lost gospel and in this sequence. Apart from my addition of the saying to avoid the yeast of the Pharisees, my reconstruction largely agrees with theirs. In other words, only in Luke do we have this brilliant sequence of logia, and it gets botched in the other Gospels. So let's reverse this. Advocates of the far hypothesis, including Goodacre, would suspect that Luke simply derived these sayings either from Mark or Matthew and assembled them. But to defend this book, they must propose an interpretation something like the following. And this is the heart of the argument, Derek. And I'm glad your viewers can see it on the page. Luke must have seen in Mark or Matthew the saying about the yeast of the Pharisees in the story of Jesus scolding the disciples at Stee, then stripped it of its narrative contents and deleted the reference to Herod in Mark or the Sadducees in Matthew, and then used it to introduce his speech about fearless confession. So that's the first thing that they have to do. The second is, Luke must also have seen in the logion of the hidden becoming public in Matthew and transformed it into a warning about private speech that had been polluted by the yeast of the Pharisees. So instead of a command to proclaim Jesus, it becomes be careful about what you say because it'll be exposed. Then Luke would have had to do this. He must have seen in Luke's mission speech the logion about confessing or denying Jesus.
Matthew's, you mean? Matthew's mission speech?
Yeah, Matthew's mission speech, the logion about confessing or denying Jesus, but twice changed my Father who is in heaven into the angels of God. He also must have replaced Jesus' use of I to the more enigmatic, the Son of Man, which is highly unlikely. Luke then must have seen in Matthew's Beelzebul controversy the logion about the unforgivable sin, moved it to a different context, and deleted neither in this age nor in the age to come. We're not done. Luke also must have seen the promise in Mark or Matthew that the Spirit would assist believers tried before synagogues and added to his speech about faithful confession. Moreover, he would have excluded the following from the Matthean version. Councils and flog you, and you will be brought before governors and kings because of me as a testimony to them and to the Gentiles. Now that's even though these statements are congenial to the trial scenes in the Acts of the Apostles. We're not done. Finally, and most significantly for the Q plus Papias hypothesis, how in the world would the far hypothesis explain doublets and avoided doublets in Matthew and Luke? when the non-Markan versions consistently seem to be more primitive. Now, I would explain them as derivative of similar content in the Lost Gospel and Mark, caused by Mark's creative incorporation of many of its logia. Matthew and Luke inherited the overlapping content from both sources and thus created doublets. That's why they're both earlier and later than Mark. At other times, they omitted Markan version in favor of the more primitive parallel in the Lost Gospel, what I have called an avoided doublet. Now, I'm going to let you ask questions of me, but I want to summarize what this means. In sum, it is much more likely that Luke 12, 1-12 preserves the wording and the brilliant sequence of these logia from a document earlier than Mark and known also to Matthew. Luke is earlier than Matthew. Matthew is earlier than Mark. When the Matthean and Lucan evangelists redacted Mark, the direction of dependence returned to the sequence of their composition. Mark is earlier than Matthew, and Matthew is earlier than Mark. Many of the arguments I've made have been made by other advocates for Q according to the two-document hypothesis. But because my reconstruction is about half again as long as standard versions, I prefer to call it Q+, or better, the Logoi of Jesus, its most likely original title, which requires an alternative chapter verse numbering system. Therefore, I would schematize the intertextual development of these 5 sayings like this. Now, there you have the 5 bullet points that go from Logoi to Mark, and from Mark then to Matthew and Luke, but also independently in going to Luke. So that's basically my presentation. And so we can talk about it. I could read a concluding paragraph, but I think that's enough for now.
So I know that and I'm going to speak criticism if you don't mind, also to get your have you answer some ideas that I want. Number one, when we look at this diagram right here that I find very interesting about the logi, the sayings of Jesus, all of the arrows are touching Mark. Are there any scenarios where there are sayings that aren't found in neither Mark or Matthew that are in Luke that you think come from the logoi?
Yes, there are. So this obviously was highly selective of 5 units, 5 logia, but there are many examples of where you have things in Luke that are suspiciously from the Lost Gospel. Now, to do that, you can't use reversed priority. You have to use 3 other criteria, and I'll just tell you what they are because your question is a very important one.
Thank you.
When you're reading Luke, and you know that he's got 3 sources in front of him, that is the Lost Gospel, Mark, and Matthew. Then you read something in Luke, it's only in Luke, but it looks like it's a traditional saying, that Luke did not make it up. It doesn't have Lucan typicalities in it. So that raises a critical issue. The second criterion that's related to this then is coherence. Is the piece that seems to be traditional coherent with the other things we know about the Lost Gospel? So that if it's way off base, let's say that there's a saying about the Son of Man. The Son of Man is extremely important for the Q document. Or an archaic use of the word basileia tou theou, the kingdom of God, which is also very important for the Q document. So if we can establish that it's a traditional saying and it's coherent, that helps. And the other is it atypical of Luke? Which is similar to the other. So anyway, those are other criteria that one can use to kind of tease out. By the way, this special material in Luke is called Lucan Sondergut, special material. It's only in Luke, but in some cases, scholars opine that it may have come not from Mark or Matthew, which is clear, it doesn't come from them. But it could have come from, it's more likely to have come from a Lost Gospel than from Luke himself.
Interesting. So that's a very good question. I never had you answer that one, actually. I'm glad I asked it because that makes me think of some of the things. I'm trying to be highly critical in my thinking here. Another question I think would be important, our audience would love to hear, and maybe they didn't think about this. Some probably did think about this, is when, like the material that in those examples that you showed on the screen of Mark and Matthew's use of certain things, whether it be my Father in heaven or whether it be before princes and queens and or princes, you know what I mean? In front of the public, you're going to be presenting the gospel, and the words, they'll come to you. Don't worry. The Holy Spirit will give it to you. Like all the added fat, if you will. Where did that come from? Do you think Mark's imagination came up with some of this stuff in terms of what he's creating? That's not really in the sayings of Jesus in the Lost Gospel, but he added that to his own narrative?
Yeah, but I don't, yes, he adds it as a way of explaining the thing he sees in the text, often because he doesn't like something in the text, he's objecting to it, but more often than not, simply to make it clear. Because there's a lot in the Lost Gospel that is unclear. One of my favorite examples is I attribute to the Lost Gospel the saying that Jesus saying, "I will destroy this temple that is made with hands and build another that is not made with hands." Mark sees that and hates that saying. He puts it on the lips of the false witnesses at the trial. That is, we heard him say that he will destroy this temple and build another. Well, that's clearly an improvement over having Jesus declare that he's going to destroy the temple after the temple's, Mark's writing after the temple's been destroyed. Where's Jesus to build another? He certainly is not going to build it in 3 days. So the 3 days that Mark adds probably is reference to his resurrection and the newness of the kingdom of God being present after Jesus' death. But there are a number of examples. So these changes are not arbitrary. They're not, they're hermeneutically significant, we would say. They're interpretive. Now, in order to do so, he frequently messes up the balance of the Q saying, and you can see that it's better preserved in Luke say. So, sure, I think this is what ancient authors did. They saw something, they liked it, they wanted to disambiguate it or to explain it or to correct it, and so they do it. So this is not a sinister thing they're doing. It's what creative authors do.
I was going to say that's an interesting way of putting it, because the way I'm seeing what you're saying and using Luke chapter 12 that we're talking about, or is it chapter 12? Let me see.
Yes. Yeah, Luke 12. Yeah.
Luke 12. What I find fascinating about this is if I were to ask Dr. Goodacre this question about Luke and what's going on, he would have to go through those final criteria that you point out, like Luke's he's erasing this, he's erasing that, he's redoing this. There's a lot of work that has to be done to make Luke say what it's saying versus Matthew and Mark. And then what you've done there, if you allow what you're saying in Luke to be the case, you're making Mark be a text that's using the logoi, but he's correcting that version. Whereas Luke says, I like what the logoi says here. In fact, I'm fine with it as it is. Whereas Mark's saying, I have to do something different. I just think it's a very interesting hypothesis, because both of you gentlemen will have explanatory strengths in certain areas, depending on how you look at it. And I can see why there's a problem with the synoptics. But what you're showing in Luke here, and not only in Luke 1 through 12, I suspect there are other places we could do a show on these topics, for example, but that's why they need to get the book. Many, absolutely. But I want to go back to what you said about the difference between the way Matthew and Luke say use Q. I want to talk about it with Mark as well. And I'm going to try to do some work with the hands. Okay.
This is going to be the Q document. Mark comes along and he sees the Q document, and he doesn't like it very well. So he omits a lot that is there and transforms a lot of it in order to create a different kind of narrative. And in doing so, he relies heavily on Homeric epic and Greek poetry, so that the Q material is worked into his narrative that is doing something different, where he's got characterization, he has shipwreck, we have the death of Jesus, and so on. Now, Matthew comes along and he sees both of these. And what he wants to do is to put them together for his community so that you have both Mark and Q. And this is what he does. He melds them together. And he scissors and pastes them in a very granular way, so that often these sayings butt each other, like in the Sermon on the Mount, where we get mostly the Q document rearranged, but elsewhere, like in, let's say, the mission speech, where you have Mark and Q material side by side, and beautifully and homogenized, if you will. Now, Luke comes along, and I think he saw what Matthew did and said, I can do better than that. And so he's got these two primary sources, Mark and Q. He knows Matthew, but he's got Mark and Q too. And what he does is put them together like this. Some Mark, some Q, some Mark, some Q. He scissors and pastes it, but not in a granular way. He's not homogenizing. He's sequencing material. So you have similarities to Matthew in the infancy narrative. Then you get the beginning of a narrative that follows Mark. Then you get the big travel narrative where you've got all kinds of Q stuff. Then you go back to Mark. So he is less granular and organic in his work. That's why Matthew is considered so brilliant at doing this intertextuality, where Luke is much more scissors and paste with large units.
Okay. This is interesting. I really want to ask you this too, because your thesis of the epics, the Greek epics, plays an important role into this entire thing. And you're unique in this respect, because people could talk Q all day long, but how many are trying to incorporate the mimetic method of the Q hypothesis, combining with the literature and narrative format we find in Matthew, Mark, Luke, the whole nine? So my question is this, because you're the one-stop shop for this, and I love that. Is Luke, not only, you've pointed out he knows Q, he knows Mark, he knows Matthew, is he looking at any of the Greek epics here, or is all the material he's using coming from Matthew and Mark in terms of the Greek epic stuff?
Oh, no. He's got his own wonderful, wonderful imitations of Homer. I'll give you two examples. What is the story about Lazarus and the rich man in Hades other than a tour of hell? Odysseus goes to the netherworld and he visits the dead. Jesus' story talks about Abraham and Lazarus and the rich man all in Hades. The word is the Greek word Hades. Furthermore, when Odysseus goes to the netherworld, he sees a rich man named Tantalus, where we get our word tantalizing, he sees water coming up to his chin, but he can't drink it. What does the rich man say? Have Lazarus dip his finger into water to cool my thirst. At the end of the Odyssey, Odysseus comes back and reveals his identity to his father Laertes by revealing the scar on his leg. Now, Jesus shows himself to the disciples by revealing the wounds on his hands and his feet. And the one story happens at the end of the Odyssey, the other happens at the end of the Gospel of Luke. Both of them are recognitions by wounds. And even the vocabulary is the same. The revelatory word, I am, And it says in the Odyssey that Odysseus wanted to see if his father recognized him by his eyes. In Luke, Luke writes, and the two men on the way to Emmaus had their eyes were kept from recognizing him. The same vocabulary that is used in those cases. Luke has other examples of really brilliant rewritings of the Homeric Epics, and surely had seen what Mark did and approved of it and extended it especially in the Acts of the Apostles, as we talked about in an entire session earlier.
Wow.
Now here's another thing about here's another thing about this combination. Why is it that none of the examples that I can find of Homeric imitation in the Gospel of Mark have parallels in the Q document, in the sayings? And why is it that there's nothing in the sayings gospel that I can find that is a clear indication of Homeric imitation? So that Mark has two projects going on. One is the revision of a lost gospel that he uses but isn't terribly fond of, and his project to enhance the reputation of Jesus the teacher to make him competitive with the likes of Odysseus and Heracles and so on. So those are two interlacing projects. And Derek, I've said this before on your program, but I'm going to say it again. The synoptic problem is not going to be solved until two things are recognized. And by the way, I don't think I've properly identified reconstructed all of the Q document or Q+. There's still a lot of work to be done. But the two things that have to be recognized are the existence of a lost gospel that is known to Luke and Matthew and Mark, but best preserved in Luke, and Mark and Luke's heavy investment in rewriting Greek poetry. So the solution to the synoptic problem has two pieces. It's not just reconstructing a lost gospel. It's also recognizing how they incorporate the larger narrative world of Greek poetry. And until that's done, we're still going to be stuck with the synoptic problem.
You know, I have to admit that this is mind-blowing, because when I've read your works on the mimesis, you know, we've done an interesting thing so far in MythVision. We went from Q plus Papias and then, you know, kind of the Markan ideas, the Mark and Matthew, how they're using mimetic stuff of the Greeks. And then we started getting into Luke a little. And our next show was going to be the Dionysian, but we had to stop. How could we leave the synoptics without going backwards a little? And you just had the debate, which is cool, because I couldn't see how Q or Q plus really mattered in this. I mean, I was like, you know, I can give it or take, you know, you don't have to have it, you can have it, you know. But with this show that you just presented, you showed in a reverse way, in my mind, I don't know why it clicked for me this way, why Q matters and why it makes sense that you have this Jewish saying of a man, whether you call him a sage, a prophet, a rabbi, whatever you want to call this Jewish man here, and why there's connection to the Greek epics, like what's going on here. And Q it's almost like oil and water, so to speak. Whereas Q on its own, or Q plus on its own, it doesn't work. So Mark has to manufacture for a larger audience. And that also could give us a little bit of dating in a way, in a weird way, not an empirical way, but in an assumption type way, that this Christianity is already now reaching areas that aren't strictly Judaism type areas. This is now hitting.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
So this is so interesting.
Exactly right.
Oh man. Wow. Why did it just come to me? It's like, you know, let him who has eyes see, and they just fell off my eyes. I'm like, oh, I know what you're trying to say now. This is really.
Do you remember Do you remember in one or two of the previous sessions, I talked about social identity theory?
Yes.
Social identity theory is a huge contribution to precisely what you're talking about. The social identity of the Q author and the Q material. Let's talk about the Q material.
Okay.
It's Jewish. Its concern is on making the law more compassionate. Its primary enemies are Pharisees, and so Jesus is portrayed as being more compassionate and more appealing and more suffering than the Pharisees. And so that's your social context. When you get to the Gospel of Mark, your intertexts are Jewish, but they also are now Greek. That Jesus is not portrayed as better than just the Pharisees. He's better than the Olympian gods. He's better than Homeric heroes. And so now the social identity of the author becomes clearer. He's also writing after the Jewish war. So now Judea is in rubble. The temple is destroyed. The fortunes of this religious movement have to move from Jews to Gentiles. So whereas the Q document forbids the disciples to go to a mission to anyone but the household of Israel, if that's what happened in the Gospel of Mark, there'd be no good news to the Gentiles. The end is not coming until the gospel is preached to the Gentiles. I would love to see someone do a more comprehensive comparison of the social identities of the various gospel moments, and to then be able to chart not just the literary developments, but also the sociological developments. Who's the good guy? How we define in-groups? Who are the out-groups? Who are the villains? And we're going to see that those social identity markers shift from one document to the next. And I hope we see soon that they shift also again in the Gospel of John, but even inside the Gospel of John, they shift twice, because we have three different literary moments, and they have different social identities. So we'll get to that at some point.
Wow. I have one thing I'd like to say, and then take me wherever you will. I've been enlightened by this episode. I really am, and I'm glad that we made it this far. It sounds to me, correct me if I'm wrong, of course, I really want all the criticism I can get and making sure that everybody's getting where I'm coming from. I talked a lot in past episodes, not with just you, but others, on Matthew and why Matthew's saying, to the Phoenician woman, by the way, she wasn't a Phoenician woman in Mark. She's a Canaanite, which is right into the social identity thing. Like, why did you change it from a Canaanite to Phoenician? Either way, but he's calling her a dog. Then he's saying stuff like, don't go in the way of the Gentiles, don't go in the way of the Samaritans, the half Jews, rather only go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. It sounds to me that Matthew liked Mark's epic combination. He said, this guy's really hitting some stuff. I have no problem being, if the author's a Jew, and I think he was, that's just my opinion. Matthew is like, you know what? I'm a Jew, but I might be a Hellenistic one, so I know the Greco-Roman world. And you know what? I really like how Mark made Jesus better than all the other gods, but I also like how Q keeps him Jewish to the core. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to make sure I keep the Moses context of Q and make him, fulfilling the Hebrew scriptures while demolishing the foreign gods of the current context we live in the Greco-Roman world, and making him supreme above all of them. Is he kind of going backwards in a way? And that's why we see some reverse priority by Matthew, whereas the Farrer hypothesis, in your estimation, isn't really able to explain this really, really well, other than to say, Matthew's just being creative. All of this is just out of his own mind and imagination. What you're suggesting is Matthew's actually pulling from Q and saying where Mark didn't like that stuff, he did, and he's trying to keep a Jewish core. He's not just some random Jewish guy who says, I don't like Mark, let me fix Mark only. he's trying to do some patchwork, if you will, fixing Q plus enjoys the epic stuff. Correct me if I'm wrong.
It's not that you're wrong. It's rather that I would articulate it in a different way, and it's a little more nuanced. In my view, Matthew has seen both the restriction of the mission to the 12 to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And Matthew's the one gospel that retains that. But it's clear that he's not fond of it, as fond as you're making it out to be.
Right.
That doesn't appear in Mark, but in the Canaanite woman, she basically puts the Q document into Jesus's ear and shoves it in hard. You know, even the dogs like what comes. So don't give me the stuff about only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, because even dogs are happy with the table scraps. So in the end, of course, at the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus, the risen Jesus, tells the disciples to go to all the Gentiles.
Right.
And to preach the gospel. So now the commission in Q has been overturned. It now is explicitly a mission to the Gentiles. Now, does that mean that Matthew was not aware of adding a Jewish flavor to the Markan gospel, as you're saying? I think he surely does. And this is why Matthew also has these wonderful formula quotations. This happened in order to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet or by the Psalter or whatever. So it's a way of hooking the experience of the Markan Jesus back into the biblical epic. Absolutely. The same thing, but he also has these antitheses. You have heard it said of old, and then he'll quote a legislation from Moses, and then he says, but I say to you, and he quotes something from the Logo of Jesus, which shows that he is listening to Torah in stereo, Moses in one ear and Jesus in another. So that on the question of debate, of divorce, Moses says divorce is allowed, but Jesus says divorce is not allowed. So these topics get juxtaposed. So you're correct in saying that Matthew, if you will, is re-Judaizing Mark, but he's doing so in a way that also acknowledges the Gentile mission. And in that regard, I think Mark would have no trouble with it.
Wow. You know, I kind of, when you said, and I must be honest, when you told me yesterday on the phone, we got to touch on Q again, I was kind of like, okay, let's touch on Q again. But I'm like, what can we get out of it? Like, what else can we get out of it? I'm telling you, this show right here was a really good one. And I learned a lot out of this one. And my appreciation, rather than just throwing out the whole idea that a lot of people do. I see them in the comment section. Well, why are you arguing for a hypothetical you don't have any evidence for? You're just arguing, you know, and I've heard the continuous, like, not even considering this as a potential hypothesis. Dr. Price, for example, who comes on the show all the time, he does think there's a Q. He thinks there's really good reason to think there was a Q. So for those who love Dr. Price, but also think Q's ridiculous, you know, ask him, you know, why would you believe there's a Q? You don't have Q in your hands. But we didn't even touch on this, and I think it'll be good to close this out. Papias believes or says, according to Eusebius is using the writings of Papias that we no longer have, and he says that there were three. We had Mark and two Matthews. You know, it would be interesting, Dr. Goodacre, if we saw that Matthew had like two compositional layers, whereas we know like John is. John has three compositional layers that you've argued in your book so well on the Dionysian gospel. But Matthew isn't carrying this strange, oh, well, both of those become one gospel of Matthew. No, there seems to be one that we're not talking about, and that's what you're trying to say is Q.
Yeah.
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 So why would that even be I mean, you know, for those who are skeptics, and I understand why, and you don't accept his theory, why is he even mentioning two? Why? what's the point? If there wasn't another one, even Dr. Goodacre does say that there may have been different gospels and different sources and things like that. Well, I mean, if that's the case, then there may have been a Q. I mean, for all we know, there could have been a Q that this was based off of. He's just not convinced, and I understand the skepticism, but you're not far-fetched in this at all, and I think there's some really good reasons to consider your hypothesis is accurate or making more sense.
Just to be clear, and I know you would agree with this, Mark Goodacre is open to the idea that there was a Q, but he's entirely skeptical about any attempt to reconstruct it or to know for sure, because there are, for him, alternative explanations to Luke's reverse priority to things in Matthew. What I hope to show today is that it is much more economical to say that Luke has another gospel that is more primitive, that he has scissored and pasted into his narrative, and the other gospels are the ones that are derivative of it. And that would be then your second gospel of Matthew, known to the elder John and Papias. So the difference between Mark and me is not primarily the existence of a lost gospel. It's on the ability of scholars now to reconstruct any of it. Now, it's never going to be perfectly reconstructed. Certainly mine is not perfect. But I think the examples that we have from Luke 12 are so compelling and require something like a lost gospel informing Luke that the other gospels pirate and cannibalize for their own efforts is reason to think there must have been a document like that, and it must have included these things in this sequence. And if so, why not continue that project more comprehensively? And that's what I've tried to do in two shipwreck gospels, and Q plus is the result of it.
Wow. Dr. Goodacre said that he did not think Luke, and this is another episode maybe for the future, he did not think the introduction to Luke is actually aware of Papias. And that was something that you guys disagreed on, whereas most people, if I'm not mistaken, do I have that backwards?
No, that's right.
Yeah. So the reversal of that is the consensus. Or at least some even argue they have nothing to do with each other. They might look similar, but you're looking for something that's not there or whatever. Can you comment on that before we go?
That would take us deep in the woods again, and into the relative dating of Luke, Acts, and Papias, and some of that's very difficult. If we had an episode devoted to that question of Papias and Luke, I would want to talk about not the prefaces, but the three accounts we have of the death of Judas, believe it or not. Not in the Gospel of Luke, but in the Acts of the Apostles. The earliest of those accounts surely is Matthew. The next earliest has to be Papias, just in terms of what's going on in the polemic. And Luke knows both. And he creates his own version of the death of Judas and makes it similar to the death of cowards in the Iliad, who are struck from behind, their guts spill out in front of them on the ground, and it uses Homeric vocabulary to do it. So I think we could have a very short episode sometime, probably would only take half an hour, 45 minutes, just to compare those. And for me, that clinches it. If there is a connection between Luke's prefaces and Papias's, this seals it in the direction of Luke knowing Papias, not the other way around.
Fascinating. Oh man, I loved your examples. Thank you for writing that and having that typed out. Our audience could keep up. And you know what I loved about that too is a lot of people who don't have good hearing or they're not able to hear, they can read and follow along with what you presented. That was well done, Dr. MacDonald. I really appreciate that. And with your debate with Dr. Goodacre, maybe I can get a show with Dr. Goodacre at some point to come and talk again and really hang out with you and poke into the weeds together. But maybe some preparation. We'll work on it. We'll try and work on it. But go get the books, ladies and gentlemen. I can't tell you enough. You got to go down there, get the material. You've been working on right now a PDF, multiple PDFs, but your work is going to be you're trying to get some free content out there for people, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep. Like to, yeah.
Well, let us know what you think about the show. Do you think the Q, after watching this show, has maybe some more reason to be, an existing document at some point? Let me know. I hope you guys at least were open-minded and considering the evidence and listening to Dr. MacDonald. I know in the debate, we didn't get to go into those examples. Like, he wasn't prepared to quote a specific verse and delve into the context and go deep into that. It was a methodological approach. However, today you got to hear some examples, and this is we just scratched the surface. This is like the tip of the iceberg. And so there's a lot more content. Go get the book, Two Shipwrecked Gospels, and get ready because we're about to talk about Dionysus next. I can't wait to. So much. Thank you. It sounds like God's knocking on your door right now.
Yeah, I've got a delivery from the grocery store, I think. We're in quarantine.
Well, don't forget, we are MythVision.